Hello and welcome. As my colleague Andrew has mentioned, I started as library director about a year ago, and I first wanted to thank my colleagues for welcoming me here, and offering support to the library throughout the last year. It is an exciting honor and privilege to be in service of American history here at the Society of the Cincinnati and its American Revolution Institute, and I'm happy to welcome you all here today and those online for this quick talk about our library collections, and in particular the orderly book of Edmund Bancroft. I hope this talk also builds on the lunch bite presented by my colleague, the museum's collection operations manager, Mr. Paul Newman, from July of 2023, an orderly book kept by the British General Robert Cunningham. The Institute's collection of orderly books and manuscript orderly books numbers around 50 plus, or more than 50 volumes, and it is one of the larger institutional holdings of orderly books in the United States. This collection is a great source of pride for the Society of the Cincinnati in fulfillment of its mission to perpetuate the memory and enduring principles of that vast event, the American Revolution. And while many of the orderly books in the Society's library document the activities of the Continental Army or local militia, there are also examples of British Army units and orderly books of the French and Indian and Revolutionary Wars. The collection is notable for its range of dates and units it covers, providing researchers the opportunity to compare examples of these critical day-to-day records of American and British military operations. Um, so what is an orderly book? Quickly, an orderly book was the controlling document of the day-to-day military life. They may have seemed like administrative drudgery of their time, almost like paperwork. However, they were required for the effective management of the Army. The officers were expected to be fully familiar with the broad array of weekly strength reports, bi-monthly muster rolls and payrolls, clothing and arms returns, inspection reports, and descriptive rosters, all being required for timely submission to higher headquarters. And the orderly book documents their knowledge there. And it is a miracle that they have survived. The content in orderly books provides a detailed account of troops' daily lives. They document everything from court-martial cases to the price of necessities charged by locals, promotions, duty rotations, work details, marching orders, and embarkations. They contain information on the day, the location, and general orders, proclamations from Continental Congress, calculations about rations, really, the list goes on. Miles and routes traveled, personal expenses, even information about lost items such as clothing and equipment. And importantly, they show enlisted men struggling with officers over conditions of their service. The orderly book tradition in the British colonies goes back to at least the French and Indian Wars, the North American theater of the 7 Years' War, which concluded in 1763. However, but we know that between around 1500 and 1800, most Western European societies moved from restricting literacy towards promoting mass literacy. This was the result of the invention of the printing press and the spread of the Reformation. For example, at the end of the Middle Ages, it has been suggested that the ability to write was restricted to less than 10% of the population. But by the mid-18th century, London and Paris had literacy levels of over 90%, which would so. So ink and letter forms played a large part in shaping the character of 18th century America. And literacy is a key towards understanding the early American story. The historian Kenneth Lockridge, who studies literacy in the colonial New England, made the case that among New England men of European origin, up to 90% were literate between 1787 and 1795. And in cities such as Boston, the rate was close to 100% by the century's end. While I can't go into literacy generally in this talk, and there may be studies and challenges to those numbers when you include the full population of Boston, you still have to see these orderly books as an examples of the social function of literacy. To be an officer meant that one had to take in information orally and write it down in digested form into a notebook. The notebook required consistency and a logic that had to be set in place over time without passion or neglect. This is perhaps why on the inside cover of Edmund Bancroft's orderly book, he composed this poem, which is faint in faint ink now, but it says, Edmund Bancroft, his book, and God gave him grace all right, to look and not to lust, but understand learning is better than money or land. When money or land is both spent, then learning is most excellent. Sort of a silly poem, but shows the emphasis that an officer would have on learning at the time, and that the orderly book is a place for sort of showing off one's learning. Um, but why are orderly books important for research? Orderly books are a primary source of the goings-on in the military camp, as I mentioned, and insofar as the officers wanted to secure the compliance of enlisted men, and at the same time, rank-and-file soldiers objected to the military hierarchy. Orderly books include information that were required for military discipline, and they reveal the conflict between officers and their men. Furthermore, I believe these books can be used to connect to the individual of the 18th century, a time of much transformation. The philosopher Charles Taylor, whose work has focused on modernity and the secular age, has suggested that the modern identity possesses a strong sense of freedom and individuality, and in opposition to the classical self, in which an objective and rationality was encoded into a hierarchical universe. These orderly books from the Revolutionary period reveal a sort of the individual as the shift was taking place towards a hierarchical, away from the hierarchical towards individual freedom. So orderly books were a key part of military discipline. We know that George Washington had made general orders in January 1st, 1776, to keep orderly books. He wrote in his orders, His Excellency hopes that the importance of the great cause in which we are engaged will be deeply impressed upon every man's mind, and wishes it to be considered that an army without order, regularity, and discipline is no better than a commissioned mob. Therefore, it is ordered and directed that not only every regiment, but every company do keep an orderly book, to which frequent recourse is to be had, it being expected that all standing orders be rigidly obeyed. And this is in January of 1776. But the orderly book we're talking about before predates Washington's orders. Um, so um, I could talk more about how this worked, but basically Washington formalized this practice of systematically keeping a daily record from general, brigade, and division orders. The orders were handed down through the ranks as they were copied into the orderly book. At the company level, the book was then kept by someone called the orderly sergeant, who then in turn read them aloud to the junior officers and enlisted men. So that's sort of, it went from an oral, like the orders were told to the officers and the sergeants, who would write it down and then read it again to the men in camp. And today we'll be talking about this orderly book that is maintained by a Massachusetts officer or man born in the Massachusetts Bay. And I want to say it's interesting that this orderly book predates Washington's orders. It is therefore an orderly book that it wasn't kept by orders. It was kept by the tradition, meaning Bancroft was keeping this orderly book out of the sense of tradition of the role of the orderly book in the militia, not from Washington's command. So who was Edmund Bancroft? Our Edmund Bancroft was born in Massachusetts in 1748. He was born and died in Middlesex County. He died at the age of 29. His father outlived him. His father was the senior Edmund Bancroft, lived until 1805 and collected a military pension for wounds sustained at Bunker Hill. We don't know if the Edmund Bancroft that kept this was at Bunker Hill, but his father was. Which calls in mind this sort of important aspect of the identity in the 18th century America. Genealogy was more than a simple record of family ties. It was a powerful force that shaped society. Family connections wielded significant influence across governmental, legal, religious, cultural, and social spheres. Edmund's father, Edmund Bancroft, wounded at Bunker Hill, was the son of Captain Benjamin Bancroft, who was the grandson of Captain Thomas Bancroft. So I did this sort of genealogy, but basically Edmund's grandfather, Benjamin, was in the militia in the French and Indian Wars. His great-great-grandfather was born in 1649, and the first Massachusetts-born Thomas Bancroft was lieutenant in the militia and was one of the men from Reading, Massachusetts, that fought in the significant portions of King Philip's War between the colonial militia of New England and the Narragansett people. So when our Edmund Bancroft here is at 27 years old, picks up a flint at this moment in 1775, he does so with 6 generations of Massachusetts men who fought before him on that same ground. And that's something to sort of think about when we think about the identity of who Edmund Bancroft was. Also, he likely had prior experience in the militia before he joined Prescott's regiment as one of 4 sergeants. The Prescott's regiment was created by the Massachusetts legislature, and it's one of the battalions that was created by the Massachusetts legislature that was then taken into the Continental Army in June 14th of 1776. And this is an auspicious date because that's the same date George Washington becomes the commander-in-chief on June 14th. So Edmund Bancroft Regiment was therefore formed as a battalion, but transformed into the Continental Army by order of Congress. So I joke with my colleagues that this was sort of the first orderly book, or one of our earliest orderly books, and it's unclear what I meant by that. But if you look at the cover, in faint ink, it says Continental Army written on the top, written on the cover in the sort of darker ink. And I say it's one of the first orderly books because it's an orderly book of one of the Massachusetts regiments. That's the first one of the first regiments that becomes the Continental Army. So it's one of the earliest Continental Army orderly books maintained in the collection, and that gives it great significance for the Revolution and its time and place. But I'm limited to talk about the orderly book can really only talk about its time and place. So it's in Massachusetts. It's 1775. We're isolated to that time and place. But again, I think it's a worthy document or worthy for further study since it's one of the first orderly books of the Continental Army. And it provides an account of the state of affairs in Massachusetts that followed the exit of Colonial Governor Thomas Gage. So with a political maelstrom caused by the Boston Tea Party, led to the Crown replacing Governor Thomas Hutchinson with Thomas Gage, who was sent from England in April of 1774 to take command of the situation, both as commander-in-chief of the army, but also as the governor of the Massachusetts Bay. And that's a key thing, that he was both the commander of the army and the governor. And in the face of a sort of difficult political situation, Gage would prove to be unsuccessful and return to Britain the next year following the failure at Concord when he went to seize military equipment and arrest the radicals. That operation failed, but it commenced the famous shot heard around the world. Gage faced losses and ran from battle to return to Boston. At that moment, the city was besieged by thousands of militiamen. Men like Edmund Bancroft, who were then changing their allegiance from crown to country. And we see this in the orderly book that I'm going to, how this happened, or how this process actually happened. On the first page, there's this account of someone who was punished for toasting Gage's health. So in the ranks, there's still someone who's in the militia, in the Massachusetts ranks at this time, in September of 16th, someone was toasting Gage's health. Thus, he was sort of maybe being irreverent or having a drink and saying, well, to Gage's health, who was the former military leader of the British Army. This person, James Finley, was deprived of his arms, put in a horse cart with a rope around his neck, and drummed out of the army. So here we're seeing the allegiances shift in this moment right here in late 1775. And that sort of this 1775 moment is important for us as we think about our 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, because the revolution was no certain thing. In 1775, there was no guarantee of what was going to happen ahead, and also there was still a chance that there was always a chance the colonists could have successfully established their rights in Parliament had the king been negotiated with and brought to an improved understanding of the Constitution. The colonist issue was before Parliament and not necessarily the king at this time in 1775. But the news of the Boston Tea Party had gotten to the king, and he writes a proclamation for suppressing rebellion and sedition of August of 1775. And when that news returns to the colonies, the writing was on the wall, so to speak, and eventually all the colonists would rethink their allegiance to the king. And at this moment, in Massachusetts in 1775, I guess people say the world turns upside down, but you have this massive shift in the political order. So the same militia who had previously been loyal to the crown were sort of also the militia who now were had to be allegiant to the new army, and so how did they establish that? It's obvious that there was great disorder, there was chaos everywhere, and this orderly book documents how they established order through through means, and I'll talk more about that. On July 4th, 1775, a year before the Declaration of Independence, Washington's general order declared, "It is required and expected that exact discipline be observed and due subordination prevail throughout the whole army, as a failure in these most essential points must necessarily produce extreme hazard, disorder, and confusion, and end in shameful disappointment and disgrace. The death penalty was then authorized for treason and mutiny, lashings for soldiers convicted of insubordination, and a host of other offenses, and officers were to be dismissed without pay for cowardice, fraud, or drunkenness." Discipline was put in place through two ways, and you see this in the account book. One is this concept of the secret passwords that are known as parole and countersign, and another is through the system of courts martial. Regarding the parole and countersign, the crowd hasn't even heard of this phrase, parole, and military people I think know what a parole and countersign is. Is there a show of hands if anyone's ever heard of that? Because it's sort of like passwords for our email, but in the past. And what the parole and countersign meant was that the countersign is a sign, word, or other signal previously agreed upon and required to be exchanged between the picket or guard and anybody approaching his or her post. So every day from the first day, you see these phrases, you see the parole and countersign at the top of each entry. They served as a sort of security system that both the British and the Continental armies were using. The countersign and this sort of like basically the sentry's job was not to let anyone pass without hearing the countersign, and not to take orders from anyone who didn't know the parole. So there's sort of like, in order to move through lines or in order to move around the city, if there's certain places, there's sort of, you had to know the sort of password to get past the line, and if you didn't, that meant you could be you were sort of guilty of an offense that could you could be imprisoned, or worse. So this concept, it really takes over, and in Washington's general orders of 8th October, he writes that he writes parole Yarmouth, countersign Amboy. For the future, the adjutant general will send the parole and countersign under a sealed cover by orderly adjutant at headquarters to the majors of the brigade. And so he said under sealed cover. And this is Edmund Bancroft's orderly book from October 8th, where he writes, "For the future, Adjutant General will send the parole and countersign in a seal cover by the orderly adjutant at headquarters to the major of the brigades." So Bancroft writes this exactly as Washington had decreed in his general orders. So you can see that everything is happening, everything that's transpiring among the military is behind these lines, which are protected through this parole and countersign sort of keyword, secret password. And I also think that this example makes it clear that this is one of the first orderly books of the Continental Army, because it's documenting Washington as commander-in-chief. That's Washington's order documented in that as commander-in-chief in that orderly book. And then I'd like to also quickly talk about a very complicated subject that I think is fun for a brief moment, about the history of court-martial and courts martial. It's an obscure subject, but I think it's fascinating, and especially as it's played out in the fall of 1775. Obviously, a court-martial are empowered to determine the guilt of members of the armed forces subject to military law. But at the time, what was the state of military law in America? In 1775, there was a significant body of American law which stood outside English common law, and of military law, there really had only been one system, the militia. There wasn't, they had one military law. And again, this orderly book is evidence of a particular time when these two armed forces facing each other had the same law system. So allegiances were still emerging, and new precedents were being set, but either side is using the same mechanisms to try each other, the sort of the courts martial. There's too many examples in there to mention all of the offenses that are going through the court-martial. A prisoner tried by the general court-martial for mutiny, riot, and disobedience of orders was found severely guilty and received 39 lashes upon his bare back and drummed out of the army. There was a number of assistants with him who received 20 lashes. There was a general court-martial of the lines to settle a prisoner, John Hawkins, guilty of the charge of basically he had stolen money and he received 30 lashes upon his bare back. It says the court martial determined that any commissioned officer or soldier who shall hereafter be detected of any game of chance near the camp or village bordering on the encampment shall without delay be confined or punished for disobedience of orders. So any sign of like gambling, card play, you would be punished or confined. And also, there's officers who are routinely found guilty of cowardice in action. One person in particular is listed for a court-martial for cowardice in the action upon Bunker Hill, the 17th of last June. So they're in this court. This is evidence in this document in the fall. They're still sort of trying cases of things that occurred a few months before. So that's fascinating. And one of the things I wanted to highlight in this conversation about court-martial is there's a case of someone named Elijah Brown. Elijah Brown was found guilty of endeavoring to defraud his continent in mustering two soldiers when at the same time they were employed and working on his farm. So that's whatever. He mustered in two soldiers and they were and then they went to work on his farm. And why is that? What's the problem here? You know, and it's an interesting story maybe. Brown claims ignorance, that he didn't know that they were working on his farm, and he was fined. He had to pay his fine to the director of the hospital, who applied the monies to use for the help of the sick in the general hospital under the director of the hospital. However, it goes on to say the general hopes that the stigma fixed on Colonel Brown by the sentence will be a sufficient warning to all officers not to be guilty of the like offense, especially as the general is confident that no general court-martial will for the future admit a plea of ignorance in excuse of so atrocious a crime. So from now on, no one can just claim to be ignorant of and be free and be found not guilty. But what was the atrocious crime? The atrocious crime was endeavoring to defraud his continent, and that's right. It's hard to read. Oh, I have the next page. So that word continent is really fascinating. It's not crown, it's continent. And it's establishing a new legal precedent that it is now a crime to defraud the continent, and that's setting a new precedent which hadn't been sort of written into military law previously. And this phrase is really interesting to me, that you see this appearance here, that it's establishing now that you cannot plead ignorance or if you are seen as defrauding your continent. Another thing that's sort of interesting in the background is the British military code for about 200 years was made up of something called the Articles of War and the statute known as the Army Mutiny Act. The former, the Articles of War, gave courts martial power in times of peace. And in 1689, Parliament under William and Mary made peacetime desertion, mutiny, and sedition crimes triable by court-martial and punishable by death. So the British military laws essentially are: one, there's Articles of War, which is everything is determined by court-martial, and two, there's the Mutiny Act, which is they have the power to power to make people guilty and punish them by death, and that makes up the British sort of laws of war in this time period. At the outbreak of the Revolutionary, and it's fascinating because there's an irony and confusion in this moment. At the outbreak of the Revolutionary War, when the British soldiers were operating under the 1774 Articles of War, the Provisional Congress of Massachusetts Bay adopted their Articles of War, which were the 1774 British Articles of War. So the both forces are appealing to the same law guidelines at this particular moment, which is why likely they had to create all this new precedent, because there was no sort of difference between the American law and the British law when it comes to military grievances. Um, the soon-to-be mustered American military was presented with its first written military code, the Massachusetts Articles of War, which in fact was the 1774 British Articles of War. Again, it's just a curious sort of irony when we think about this time, how they haven't yet established new systems of law or military law. Um, so um, the also the need for George Washington to achieve not only strict discipline, but also discipline with a whole new set of laws and rules to establish order of conduct, such as you can't endeavor to defraud your continent. In this context, this makes this orderly book fascinating, as the two armies had similar systems of punishment and discipline. The only difference was political allegiances of the jury and the guilty parties. So just to conclude a little bit, what am I trying to say about this? Um, I, I want to suggest that we must not forget that the role of the military in American life. These days, with our interest in history from the bottom up and a search for those who feel less represented in official histories, we may overlook military history. But in the colonial and revolutionary era, warfare and military was part of everyday life. Most males between the ages of 16 and 60 were in the militia. Those exempt from service were only exempt because they likely were in a skill or a trade that was useful for the war effort. Leading citizens, by virtue of their good fortune and hard work or inheritance, all assumed the roles of officers and studied the military arts enough to attain basic competence. Military history is the history of everyday life for this period. And finally, the Orderly Book is an example of the significance of discipline in forming an army that could emerge as victorious in the years to follow 1775. The Massachusetts regiments were the nucleus of the army that would emerge in the following years. As early as 1757, in his instructions to company captains, George Washington wrote, "Discipline was the soul of an army. It makes small numbers formidable, procures success to the weak, and esteem to all." Washington's recruits had only signed up through 1775. Many were part-time militiamen and not trained soldiers. From Washington's headquarters in the September of 1775, he wrote, "My situation is inexpressibly distressing. To see the winter fast approaching upon a naked army, the time of their service within a few weeks expiring, and no provision yet made for such an important event. With this orderly book, we are brought closer to the situation facing Washington and Congress in the chaos of 1775, and the importance for establishing a system of discipline, not simply as a model for Republican virtue, but to establish order enough to defend the colonies, allow for the establishment of the concept of popular rights to representation, and to overcome in a struggle for power with British pretensions of superiority to win control over half of a continent." And while we may think of the British Army as a place where full of severe and rigid discipline, this Bancroft orderly book makes it clear that the Continental Army had a very similar, and the exact same similar, system of justice that handed down harsh sentences for lashings, for derelictions of duty, and death sentences for acts of treason and desertion. And lastly, I'd like to conclude by thanking you all and reminding listeners that the library here of the American Revolution Institute welcomes all people, regardless of affiliation, to research the collections. We support scholarship in American history by offering research fellowships each year to graduate students and advanced scholars. The library's core mission is to focus on works and primary sources relating to the art of war from the period of the American Revolution, and documents the conduct of the Revolutionary War and the context of the achievement of American forces and their French allies in securing American independence. Thank you, and I encourage visitors and researchers alike to visit us in Anderson House and DuPont Circle. Thank you.
Thank you so
Yeah.
much for thank you so much for the conference. I wonder, do you happen to know, like, what was the punishment at court martial for like cowardness for that case, and why in general, like in other book, those court cases are kept? Because it seems like this is an intimate journal of the officer.
Yes.
So why, like, what was the motivation to write about the legal history and the court cases?
For motivation for me or for
For
Bancroft?
the officer.
Well, I think that It's that I don't have a so the question is why did the motivation was was for him to keep his position as an officer. He had to keep a record of he's the sergeant of the battalion, and he has to keep an orderly book. Um, by the motivation is to be a soldier, to be a good of good discipline, and to not get in trouble because that's his job. He was likely put into that position of keeping the orderly book because he was literate, had good handwriting, was the great grandson of and the grandson of men who had fought for Massachusetts. So he was an excellent sort of like recruit. I believe he would go on. But the motivation too to record that, I think, also is to set a precedent which doesn't exist anywhere else. The country at this time is there's sort of chaos. It isn't really a country. We're just talking about Cambridge, Massachusetts, and this sort of military camp that has been established there because of the political strife and craziness that's been going on for the last year. The Boston Tea Party, this total sort of like just disruption. Up is down, down is up. The king is no longer in charge, and there's no who's in charge of justice, who's in charge of keeping order and keeping peace. Writing it down sets a precedent that things can make sense, that there actually is order. So I think the motivation is to preserve sort of the system of the military order to preserve peace in the camp, but he's motivated to do it because of likely because of his generations of Massachusetts identity and his pride in the country and him being fully convinced that the country needs to liberate itself from the crown in order to achieve its destiny. Does that? I don't know if that makes, but
Yeah,
yeah.
thank you. And to follow on that, um, do you happen to know how does he get a collection of the cases, the court cases, and how accurate is like his writing, or
Oh,
it's just like his personal narrative of what happened?
it's fascinating. It's I think too if there's advanced scholars who work in this field, and one of the sort of things I often say is that no one has collected all of the cases that happened in the court martials during the American Revolution because it was happening fast and furious. So these things are not so therefore it's hard to check who else may have recorded this particular day. But the court martial, I think, was defined by 12. There was a jury and I have it written down somewhere, but the jury was made up of sort of officers and other people. And I think the court martial was sort of, it could be brought forward at any time. And it was sort of like Washington would say, tomorrow morning, we're going to have a court martial and go through all the things we have to go through. And then it was just people set up in the military camp going through everything, something that could have happened last week, last month. Someone's reporting this, that something's stolen, and so I don't know how many people recorded those to sort of to fact check them. So you have to, yes, there is suspectness in Bancroft. Maybe he's saying the wrong thing, but I think as an officer, it's his duty to sort of keep track of it accurately. But in many cases, this might be the only location that records the court martial in Massachusetts in in the fall of 1775. But maybe other orderly books would also follow certain things. And I think there are cases that come up, including Benjamin Church and his the question of his spying that might come up, that would likely come up in other account books or other orderly books because it was something that was such a big, it was going on and on and on, the case.
Thank you so
Okay.
much. And do you happen to know, by the way, the so for the crime of
Yeah.
cowardness, like what was the punishment?
Well, it's usually the lashings and having your arms take away and being not allowed
Wow.
back to join the military. I mean,
Yeah.
and that was a huge blow. It's basically having your job taken away. I mean, in light of the world we're in today, it's similar to having your job taken away for no reason. But the reason is cowardice. Um, I don't know. Cowardice could be defined as not doing your duty, and again, the punishment, as I saw it in this account book, was often having your arms taken away and being not being allowed back into the military, and lashings. And I don't mean to laugh at that, but there is this sort of interesting aspect of military history where there's sort of severe, brutal lashings in the military camp to establish order. It's a fact, and this document shows how brutal that was.
Are these books digitized?
Yes,
Have they been scanned in and
yes, not all of them are digitized. Some of them are, and there needs to be more effort to keep on digitizing, which is something we're interested in doing. This one is not digitized. The New York Historical Society has a tremendous collection of orderly books, which it has been is digitized and on microfilm, and is oftentimes cited in if historians do orderly books or use orderly books as evidence, they often cite the New York Historical Society or the New York Historical Collection because they have a substantive number. And it's sort of, it is a microfilm set. And the use of that material on microfilm predates digitization. So people would have used the microfilm set back in the 80s, and it's sort of this great, that's how people talk, that collection is really the collection of orderly books. The collection of orderly books here at the society that have been accrued over 70 years haven't been digitized on in one set. So we have a couple digitized, but not all of them. But that's something we want to do in moving forward is to get all of them digitized to become a data set, which could then be transcribed, and you could then start to get all these cases out. And I think that's an exciting work to think about how you could digitize these orderly books here or Massachusetts Historical Society or New York Historical, and start to sort of fact check them against each other to make this sort of like collection of cases.
that was what immediately came to mind is this is actually a good, valuable use case for AI as opposed to a useless use case for AI to cross-reference all of these.
Yes, there's lots of new work with handwriting detection, so computers detecting manuscript hand like so that a computer could digitize. That's really decent, and I think now we're at the point where you could digitize that and then OCR it to get optical character recognition from it, and it would be need some correction, but yeah, I think that you could use a computer to sort of automatically pull the data out of this, and then it would might need some hand editing.
Yeah,
Yeah,
you always want the human in the loop to double
yeah.
check.
And also we're the amazing and special thing about the American Revolution Institute is we're here for all people and not solely for advanced researchers. So there might be and likely are very important projects happening in this space in sort of like advanced research, but and we could collaborate with them, but we also want this material to be accessible to all people. So we're straddling the line between popular history and advanced history. If that so I'd love to, but I'd like to continue this work in a way where we could digitize it and work with advanced researchers as well.
Thank you.
We do have some online questions,
Okay, thank you.
Thomas. Start with a softball one for you. Do we know the cause of death for Bancroft? Edmund
I don't know
Bancroft?
the cause of death, but uh, I have his service up, and I suspect he died of wounds in service, but he died in 1777. What's confusing is his father has his same name, and his father continues to collect pensions through 1805. And so you could, in databases, genealogical databases, Edmund Bancroft is Edmund Bancroft, and you think, oh, that's the Edmund Bancroft. But this one dies in 1777, according to the Heitman book, which is and I'm not sure where Heitman gets that source, but I think he died in service at the age of 29. I mean, I would imagine wounds, because it's 77, and he was I think he was a first lieutenant at that point, because he also had a series of promotions ending with first lieutenant in a Massachusetts Continental Regiment, and he dies in 77. So I don't have to put it together, but
Thank you. Do we know the provenance of this quarterly
yes,
book?
it was acquired by the great library director Sandra Powers, the first library director who helped form the collection, what becomes known as the Ferguson Collection. The first library director at the Society of the Cincinnati, Sandra Powers, an amazing librarian and an important figure for the field of library science. She acquired it, I think, through the trade. Thus, it was something that a descendant owned or maintained, and then it lost hands, and it was purchased in the 1980s. But it was through purchase.
Okay.
Or
After you mentioned Washington's orders on keeping orderly books, Was there after that decision or those orders, was there a specific rank within the officer corps that
I mean,
was given responsibility to keep
I
the
think it's the
orderly book?
sergeant. I mean, I still need to know. I'm still learning that 'cause I think that the official ones were kept by the sergeant, meaning that the title, the sergeant was the person who kept the orderly book. However, other people could have kept orderly books if they wanted to, but the sergeant's orderly book was the main orderly book because they took the commands from the brigade. I forget how the hierarchy works, but I think that the officially the orderly books were meant to be written by the person who was the sergeant. That's but but that could be fact checked by computer. And I think in many cases, they're not always kept by the sergeant. And an orderly book could be kept by a lieutenant or someone else. And and it becomes sort of common practice to just maintain an orderly book. So it's not always the sergeant doing it. Yeah, and it's there's a lot of research there.
And then and we obviously know that, September through December 1775, no major battles or anything happened. Were there some highlights that jumped out to you from the orderly book?
Well, the highlight to me is really that this is that although this is simply a Massachusetts sort of battalion, it becomes the Continental Army, and I think that's sort of really fascinating. There's a page. Well, I didn't really go into it, but this page on October 22nd shows the deputies from the Honorable Continental Congress appearing at sort of at camp. So the in October of 22nd of 1777, this is the Continental Congress sort of arriving in October to have a summit with Washington, and I think that's a really important that record because that's of great significance for Continental for the plan to deal with how to enlist people to continue the war effort in 1776. And I think that's sort of the subject of that conversation. So that's really awesome that that's captured there.
Thank you. And one viewer notes the quality of paper looking very good.
Yeah.
And he's curious to know, does the library do anything to keep, um, what does the library do? How are these precious
Yeah.
orderly books preserved and maintained here?
The best thing that we have is our temperature and humidity controlled storage, which we monitor and seek to reduce the changes in humidity because the worst thing for paper is a fluctuation of humidity and temperature. So we keep it in a temperature humidity controlled vault and monitor that. The reason why the paper is in good condition also is it's made of cotton or like fiber. So this is not tree fiber paper. This is paper that was produced from sort of leftover cotton rag. And on the first page, it says at the very top of the first page, it says Captain, I forget, Farewell or Falwell, 1 quire of paper. Below that is the handing out of flints. As a library person, I'm always happy to talk about how important paper is, but paper was an object of war. What was the Stamp Act on? They were taxing paper. Paper was the way in which the colonial authorities or any authority could establish themselves by recording things and saying something is true or something happened. So the possession of paper is the most important for a war effort. So much so that the first thing Edmund Bancroft writes down in his account book is who has the paper.
Perfect. And then in our collections, is it only, you mentioned
Yeah.
Paul's the orderly book that Paul discussed in his lunch bite, which was a British officer.
Yeah.
Is that the only British officer that we have, or are there
No,
a
I
few
believe
more after that?
we have several orderly books of British officers, and I think that also speaks to our strength and our interest in not solely the American Revolution, but the art of war in the 18th century. We have orderly books from the British perspective and the American perspective, and that what's fascinating is to see how they're the same and different as these this during the revolution as a new country emerges and that becomes the United States. But we do have British orderly books and many orderly books maintained by French officers and their service to the Royal French Navy in particular in the collection here. So there's also French orderly books, and the French orderly book tradition is, there's even more French orderly books because everyone seemed to keep one as opposed to being simply one officer. So there's lots of orderly books from the French Army and French Navy maintained by lots of people in different ranks. It wasn't solely like one person and one rank maintaining an orderly book. So we have lots of French orderly books as well, and that's a fascinating and amazing collection that we also steward and preserve and keep safe.
Perfect. Good plug. I think that's a great place to wrap up. Thomas, thank you very much. Thank you all for attending in person and wherever you may be at home. And as always, for your continued support of our mission. So we'll see you next time. Until then, have a good weekend.
Thank you.